Good morning. It's always great to come to a community that's already started the conversation about missing middle housing. I noticed in some of your planning documents that the topic is inserted and embedded in the conversations happening. And I'm always excited that the conversation about this missing middle housing topic in terms of providing diverse housing choices is spreading to all parts of the country, including sort of small to medium-sized towns like Boise. And I think it's really, really important for any community I go to, whether it be large or small, to be talking about this in terms of really housing for all, housing choices for different people who want different choices, because I think it's inevitable to retain sort of people within your community, to encourage talented businesses to come to your communities, to stay in your communities, and ultimately to basically provide a really diverse type of housing, both in your downtown, adjacent downtown neighborhoods, as well as to larger parts of the surrounding community. And so this topic of missing middle housing first kind of percolated in my mind about 17, 18 years ago. We were doing a project in Santa Barbara County, and they were already starting to fill some of the housing crunch with housing prices and people being displaced and people having a hard time finding housing. And the other conversation that we're having in the community of Isla Vista was there was a group before we came in, and the conversation was, we do not want any housing above 18 dwelling units per acre. And we could never figure out where that number came from, what that number meant. It just meant that anything above 18 units per acre was really scary, right? And they didn't want it, and they couldn't really explain why, but it kind of, one of the reasons I feel that the missing middle housing topic and discussion has spread so broadly is that there's a real need to reframe the conversation about housing in the communities that we live and work in. And what I mean by that is this term, this concept, enables us to get away from using the terms like density that are really scary to people, terms like multifamily housing, terms like upzoning, that really sort of are a bad starting point for a conversation about providing diverse housing choices. And I think missing middle fills this gap. So in this project in Santa Barbara County, what we did is we did a walking tour. We went to downtown Santa Barbara, the neighborhoods adjacent to it, and we saw a lot of great missing middle housing types. We saw bungalow courts, we saw fourplexes, small what we call a mansion apartment, that's about 8 units. And then we came across this courtyard apartment building. And everybody in the citizens committee loved this housing type, right? It's like, this is exactly what we want in our community as part of this master plan and the new form-based code that we are creating. And so we walked around, we talked about the characteristics that people liked about this. It's 2 stories. It's actually on a street that's primarily single family. Then I did a little bit more snooping around. I counted some mailboxes, I counted some doorbells, I counted the gas meters, and I came back and I said, hey, by the way, this is 42 units per acre. And they were shocked. And I think a lot of people, so it changed the conversation about, well, what is it about the form of that building that we can reinforce in the new form-based code, the new zoning, that would enable them to integrate types like this even up to 42 units per acre in a way that's compatible with their community and will provide the housing choices they so badly needed. And so that conversation has really just evolved since that point, but it really struck a chord with me as well as the members of this committee that that conversation about housing should not start with density. It should start about compatible form and character. And so let me talk a little bit about sort of why this is an important conversation. Is number one, there is a tremendous mismatch between what the market wants and what our cities and towns are providing in terms of type of housing. And just to give you a few examples of this. And this is a statistic from Chris Lineberger that's probably about 5 or 6 years old, but I think it's still very relevant, actually even more relevant, is that there's a 20 to 35% gap between the demand for walkable urban living and the supply in any community you go into. So you can imagine that if you have that gap, it becomes a very simple supply and demand sort of calculation in terms of where the prices are going to go. So I would say right now that this gap is probably closer to 40 or 50%. So even in Boise here, there's probably 20, 30, 40% of your market that wants to live in a walkable urban context. Now, that might be downtown, but it also might be North End, Hyde Park, all these great sort of those downtown adjacent neighborhoods. And number one, they may not be able to afford some of those neighborhoods, or number two, maybe some of those neighborhoods have gotten to the point of disinvestment where they're just not quite attractive yet, and there's not the amenities there for those types of neighborhoods. But this is a gap that occurs everywhere. Then jump into some statistics by Arthur Nelson. So these are pretty stunning. By 2025, 75 to 85% of households are going to be without children. So you can imagine, yes, even here where there's a lot of big families, he actually was doing this research in Salt Lake City and sort of was questioned about it and went back and sort of made sure he dotted his I's and crossed his T's. Even in a place like Salt Lake City or Boise, Idaho, where there are a lot of large families, it might bump up 2 or 3% difference. But you can imagine we have for 60, 70 years been building houses for big families. And so you can imagine what simply a shift like this does to the types of housing and the size of housing that people are looking for. Another really stunning statistic, there is currently across the United States a 3 million unit shortage in small lot and attached housing units. So think about that. So if you're a smart builder developer like David Hale here, you sort of find that product type, you focus on it, and the builders and developers that we've found across the country that are focusing on this are doing really well because there is a tremendous pent-up demand and a shortage of that housing. And so, you start thinking, but there's a lot more of these statistics that, I could go on and on about. And if I encourage you to look up Arthur Nelson and just look at some of his research to reinforce and sort of supplement some of that information. But the second thing that we're finding is that conventional zoning that's based on use and density cannot effectively regulate for the mix of housing types that exist in a lot of these neighborhoods that have the missing middle. A lot of these were built prior to actually zoning being in place. And finding that it's in a lot of ways, it's just too blunt of an instrument. Like, look at these pencils that, your zoning is kind of like the dull pencils on the side. Every city we've been into, so we do, in addition to doing architecture and sort of master planning, urban design, we do a lot of zoning code updates in the terms of replacing them with form-based codes. A lot of cities, they've added extra layers. They've added overlays. They've added design guidelines. They've added all of these extra sort of bits of regulation that are attempting to get to an effective tool, but they're still really struggling and often have made the process so complicated that it's only discouraged the building of these types even more. One of the exercises we go through when we're doing these, especially with the citywide codes, is what we call a micro-scale analysis. And what it is it's really a sampling of the existing patterns. So this was in Vallejo, California, where we'll just take a typical block in a downtown adjacent neighborhood, and we'll assess it, lot size, number of units, setbacks, what have you. And what we found in a neighborhood like this is that, there's some of these 6-plex, 8-plex building types that are not, they're the scale of a house. But this one happens to be 72 units per acre at 2.5 stories. So a dense building does not have to be a big building. You can get density in a small footprint building, and that's really ultimately what missing middle is about. So the disconnect here is, so this is a low density residential zone that we sampled this block, and so it's 1 to 9 dwelling units per acre. So only 2 of the 8 lots on this block actually were not non-conforming. They actually were underneath that 9 unit per acre threshold. The rest of the units on that block were above that 9 unit per acre threshold, so they were non-conforming. And so the other thing is that building type that I just showed you, 70 units per acre. So you can tell there's a disconnect between kind of the zoning that's put on top of these places and the range of housing types that already exists. And so we need to think about a new operating system and a new set of tools to more effectively regulate those types, both in terms of making them conforming, but also in terms of making sure that if there's a market for it, that builders are allowed to sort of build new types in a similar form and scale. So what is missing middle housing? So you've probably seen this diagram, but when we created this diagram, I think it really opened the eyes to a lot of people, is on your far left-hand side is the single-family house in the white. On the far right-hand side is the 4, 5, 6-story condo building or vertical mixed-use building. And what missing middle is it's all those housing types in between. It's that bungalow court, it's that fourplex, it's the courtyard apartment that I just showed you, that are the scale of a house, but they have multiple units within them. And why we call them missing is because there haven't been a lot of them built in the recent past. And there's a lot of reasons. There's zoning that gets in the way. Simple things like parking, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, can get in the way. They're kind of hard to finance, especially if you get over 4 units. Who's building them? There's just not, there aren't production builders out there that are sort of cranking these things out. It's usually the small builder that's sort of in a community and kind of building these 1, 2, or 3 at a time. And so that's why we call them missing. These are everywhere. I would say every pre-1940s neighborhood that I've walked through across the country has a really great mix of these housing types. Denver has an excellent sort of palette of these types. Salt Lake City, I think what was really interesting is the Congress for New Urbanism had their conference there, I think 2 years ago now, and I got a chance to really explore the neighborhoods and just found a really amazing collection of these missing middle types. And they had really retained their values and were doing really quite well. Portland, I was just in Portland. Not only do they have some older historic types, but there's actually some really creative builders there doing duplexes and ancillary units as well. Hey, Boise has missing middle types. You probably have driven by these hundreds of times and never noticed that they were multiple units. And I was supposed to be here early enough yesterday to sort of get out and see a lot of these, and unfortunately I didn't get the chance to do that due to the typical travel delays, but I'm going out this afternoon, and thank Diane for sending me these pictures. But you have a great mix of these types here in your downtown adjacent neighborhoods. And what's even in New Orleans. And what's interesting about every single one of these cities that we've seen these types in is they have a pretty similar range of types, the side-by-side duplex, a row house, a bungalow court. But in a place like New Orleans and every other community, these types have adapted based on the local climate and the local culture, because what you see here, this great, up in the upper left-hand side, there's the side-by-side duplex in New Orleans is basically 2 shotgun houses sort of put together. And if you don't know what a shotgun house is, it was designed such that you could basically open the front door and the back door and you'd get amazing cross ventilation. And it has deep overhangs to both shield the windows from the rain and to shade it from the sun to keep it cool. And so there's really neat kind of simple green technology built into these types in different locations where it's necessary. So just give you a quick run through of the type. So we have a side-by-side duplex. I think this is pretty straightforward, just 1 unit on the left, 1 unit on the right. They can be 1 stories or 2 stories. And we don't like to use the term density. I think that's going to become really evident. But for those of you who kind of just need to know, we've created these tables that tell you the density as an output. We don't start with density. We say, here's the type, here's the typical lot size it sits on, here's the density that it's generated, as opposed to kind of trying to cram a building into a certain density. And so this type gets up to about 17 to 19 dwelling units per acre. I don't think that's probably much of a surprise to anybody. This is the stacked duplex, and this is one of my favorite types. I actually ride my bike by this building every day. It's a ground floor unit, so the door on the right enters into the ground floor unit, and the door on the left-hand side takes you up a set of stairs to the flat on the upper floor. And once again, it looks like a house, right? You would never unless you looked very carefully, know that that was a multiple unit building. Once again, that generates about 17 to 19 units per acre. Here's the bungalow court. A really, really fantastic type. The units tend to be pretty small, typically about 600, 700 square feet. And these types can generate up to like the mid 30 dwelling units per acre. I mean, pretty amazing. It's a lot of it has to do with the small buildings, and the other piece of this is a lot of times they don't have a lot of off-street parking, maybe one space per unit, and so it's just a really great type. The carriage house, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The fourplex, 2 ground floor units, then you go up a set of stairs in the middle, and then 2 units on the top. Once again, it's just the scale of a house. If you look at this building as you're going down the street, it's no bigger than the scale of a house. The multiplex small. So this is a 4-unit building. This is actually in a really great project called Daybreak, just outside of Salt Lake City in South Jordan. If you haven't seen this master plan community has done a really amazing job of integrating missing middle housing types throughout the different neighborhoods. And so this is a 4-plex unit built by Holmes Homes. And this, once again, generates about 33 units per acre. And then townhouses. I think that's a pretty straightforward type that a lot of the markets have figured out. Ideally, the types are facing a street and engaging, sort of really activating that street edge. Another really great type that I like is what we call the live-work. And we were having this conversation at dinner last night that what is a live-work? It can, it's a pretty broadly defined type. But this type we've designed as a fee simple. So you basically have one buyer. It's on a 25-foot wide lot can be 70 to 110 foot deep, depending on if you want an attached or detached parking garage. It has a flexible ground floor space, and then on the right-hand side is a door that takes you up to the 2-level row house unit. And so that ground floor space is a flex space that can either be rented as an apartment, a small apartment. It can be rented for somebody to incubate a small creative business. It can be used by the owner to sort of incubate their own business. Maybe an architect or an attorney can work out of that space. And we found that these types in particular are really great as you transition off of sort of busier corridors into neighborhoods, or off of a neighborhood main street into corridors, or even the ability to incubate a small business. This was in a great project called South Main in Buena Vista, Colorado. So this is about sort of lower 20 dwelling units per acre, and back to that courtyard housing apartment. And sort of depending on the size of the unit, with smaller units, this can actually generate up to 50 dwelling units per acre. So, and that's on about a 110 by 120 foot deep lot. So really interesting. And so where do you find the missing middle housing? So in the yellow, or the sort of tan on this diagram, are the missing middle types, and the white are the single unit. And so, historically, we created neighborhoods at what we call as blended density. So the missing middle types are really sprinkled throughout the neighborhood in a way that they're compatible in scale. They just provide multiple units. And so this is one sort of context in which conventional zoning has a really, really hard time recognizing them and actually regulating them so they're not non-conforming. Then you have another condition where there's maybe a secondary corridor that might have all missing middle types along it. And this might be a good thing for a place like Boise to consider, is which corridors might it make sense to allow it to evolve into a missing middle scale. And then you transition around the corner and you're in a neighborhood that's maybe all or primarily single family detached. And then you have contexts like this, I'm sure here too, maybe up in Hyde Park, where you have the neighborhood main street. And as you turn that corner, we see this all the time, that the first 1, 2, or 3 lots, as you turn around that corner, are those missing middle types that serve as the transition into the neighborhood. And so that's another great role and place that missing middle types typically exist. So important characteristics of missing middle housing. Number one, they're located in a walkable context. And what we find is that people are typically making a choice to maybe give up a little bit of size, maybe to give up one of their 2 or 3 cars to live in one of these missing middle housing units. And so it's because it's in that walkable context, and they can walk to the coffee shop, they can maybe walk their kids to school, maybe all of the above, maybe we can walk to a grocery store. You know, it can be the most simple thing is having a single coffee shop on the corner. Linda Pruitt, who's the owner of the cottage company in Seattle, she does the great cottage course that I'm sure all of you have seen photos of at some point or another. She said the first thing her potential customers ask is, what can I walk to? So it's really, really telling that kind of her customers are asking for that as well. The second thing is a lower perceived density. And as you've noticed, all these photographs, you know, they're not intimidating. They're at a scale that's the scale of the house, and you could show those photos to anybody, and we've done this in a lot of our public processes, and people will say, yeah, I have a building type just like that in my neighborhood, or I might live right across the street from one of those. And it's a great starting point to the conversation about why these are necessary. They're small footprint buildings, and a little bit of comic relief. We're not talking about this small. We're not talking about the tiny house. You know, we're not talking about the 300 and 400 square foot units, but you know, they never get bigger than the scale of a house. And just an interesting example, I'm sure really quickly, this is just kind of an urban design exercise, is can you spot the offenders in this photograph? The buildings this is a single family neighborhood primarily, that the buildings that might be out of scale. I mean, you can immediately spot them, right? It usually has to do with, sometimes it's the width, and in this instance, it's the depth. So, you know, it's very important to think about what depth of a building is your zoning regulating for to get that compatible missing middle infill. And so just the footprint of a typical house in that scale, you can see that when a building becomes a scale like that, it becomes much more, even though it might look like a house from the front, it gets to be too big in terms of compatibility toward the rear. Small, well-designed units, and this is really, really important. 2 points I want to make is that smaller doesn't have to mean the lower end of a market. And we have a really hard time convincing a lot of builders and developers of this, is that their mindset was, our smallest unit is going to be the cheapest and the one that only the sort of entry-level market's going to buy. There's a huge market right now for baby boomers, for single women in particular, who are the biggest buyers of the cottage company's product, that want a small house, but they want quality. They don't want to, you know, they will pay good money per square foot for a unit. And this is a project we designed in Daybreak. It's what we call these they're attached townhouses that are kind of flipped sideways, but these are being offered starting at $180,000 for the smallest unit, then up to $210,000, which is actually a really good. But we need to think very carefully about how you design small units, maybe give them some tall volume to make them livable. So I think one of the conversations we were having at dinner last night was, we were talking about the real estate, and that some of the units that are having the hardest time selling in downtown are the really, really big ones, right? And what we find is that the builders who come in to a downtown or adjacent downtown and build the big units often price themselves out of the market. So it's really interesting to see that smaller is a typical characteristic, and it's something that has to be thought about. Fewer off-street parking requirements. What we have found, we've done a lot of testing, we've done this for sort of our coding as well as for our private sector clients, that you start to lose the feasibility, the financial feasibility of the missing middle types if you get above 1.5 off-street parking spaces per unit. And ideally, you're not more than requiring 1 off-street parking space. And how can you do that? The fact that these types are located in walkable urban contexts is really, really important. So that's just a really important part of this. At the point, I'm sure all the developers in here can very quickly start scratching some numbers on a table to show you that these types will not be feasible if you require 2 parking spaces per unit, or they'll be really hard to do on a lot of sites. There's simple construction, right? A really interesting project in Richmond, California, where we were doing a corridor and neighborhood plan. And we used the cottage court type, and we had our economist that was on our team run some pro formas. And we found that by using these 650 square foot detached cottages on a 100 foot by 100 foot lot, that a household with an annual income of $23,000 could afford to buy or rent one of these little cottages. So that's affordability by design. right? It's really, really powerful, and it's obviously a lot less risky to a developer to keep things that simple as well. And the last characteristic is that these types create community. And they create community in a couple of ways. They create community in terms of the broader context of a neighborhood. If you've ever lived in a neighborhood with these types, I would say that they probably have the highest block party sort of ratio per year than neighborhoods that don't have these types. There's just something about these walkable neighborhoods that sort of embody community. And these types can also embody community within them. This is just one of those. This is Conover Commons in Redmond, Washington, and so it fosters community within the project because they actually integrate a community facility, a shared community facility that enables people to get together and have events. So it's really good in that way. So I'm going to now jump to talking about effective zoning to basically provide these diverse housing choices with missing middle that I'm talking about. Okay, you guys might recognize this. This is Table 11-04.3 from your zoning code. I would say that what's really interesting, this was my 15-minute analysis of your zoning code, so I might have missed something here, but right, you've allowed townhouses with this R-1M zone, the attached housing units, and I don't know if maybe many of your projects are in that zone. So that's opened up the doors and enabled developers like David to do row houses, which is fantastic. One thing that I wondered is if that 17 unit per acre maximum density ever kind of got in the way. It's kind of the typical density, but I'm sure there's instances where it might be fine to do 25 or maybe even 30 and still be kind of compatible in scale. So then you jump to your R3 zone, which is probably number one, where these types exist in terms of where the zoning's been mapped, and maybe where you would want to encourage developers to build missing middle housing. And so a couple of things jumped out at me here. Number one, the height jumps up immediately to 45 feet, which in some contexts is fine if you're wanting to evolve and transform an area from a smaller scale to a bigger scale. But what we find in most zoning codes is that even within areas that are primarily single family and they're trying to encourage missing middle, they have allowed heights up to 45 and 50 feet, and that height will not be compatible with those houses next to it. So if the intent is evolve and transform, that height is okay, but if the intent is let's provide a compatible building the same scale with multiple units, that 45 feet is going to cause a lot of heartache in your community. So just thinking about that more fine grain. The minimum lot sizes, they're not bad, right? 50 by 100 feet as a typical lot is actually a pretty typical lot size for many of these missing middle types, but we actually calibrate the minimum lot size by each of the types. Because each of the types will fit very differently on the lot sizes. And I would imagine that 7,000 square foot minimum lot size for a corner lot is really, really prohibitive for doing sort of multi-unit buildings on the corner lots. And what's interesting is historically the corner lots are where many of these types were actually built because they're more efficient in terms of their access. And so in some ways that's a bit prohibitive for the missing middle housing types. And then, this is pretty typical too. Basically, the regulations that as a building gets taller, the setbacks get bigger. And in my mind, providing a bigger setback for a building that's out of scale is not going to solve the compatibility problem, right? Either you want big buildings, either it's the right place for a big building or it's not. And it's kind of a very suburban notion that as the building gets bigger, there gets to be more space between the buildings, as opposed to a sort of a more urban mindset, which is when you get to a more urban neighborhood and the building gets bigger, the buildings actually get closer. So it's kind of, there's a lot of suburban DNA embedded into any zoning code that you need to think about kind of stripping out and replacing with a much more sort of walkable urban mindset. So that was, and ultimately what this gets down to is, I think that you think about that back to that sharp pencil, it's about getting more detailed, even in the mapping, about where these types exist. We're working on the Austin, Texas citywide development code right now. We've done maps for all 106 neighborhoods that show lots that have more than one unit in sort of different ranges, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 8, to show with maps where there's a certain percentage, 25, 30, 40% of the lots that have missing middle housing in a neighborhood that might be perceived as single family. So that enables a really informed conversation about what might the right zoning be. I would imagine that this large yellow area, I think that's Hyde Park and North End, probably, or at least Hyde Park. I would imagine there's pockets of missing middle in there that are non-conforming according to the current zoning. So it's really about sharpening the pencil and sharpening the instrument. And what we found is the most effective way to zone for missing middle housing is to actually embed the housing types, the missing middle types, actually into the zoning districts. Don't sort of let the developer kind of indirectly sort of calculate which ones are allowed. You actually just be proactive and say, sharpen that pencil. So all of our form-based codes, a component of that code are this range of allowed building types. So it's part of the code. And so as part of that process, we're what we call a calibration. We study a city, we study the types. This was in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we create this palette of allowed building types. And every type isn't allowed in every neighborhood. But what you see with the boxes, all the rectangles are the different form-based zoning districts. And the black is where each of those types are allowed. So you look at the detail. Let's look at the row house here. And so there's 4 form-based zoning districts where this town row house is allowed, and the other districts it's not. So it's really, and we talk about building types as the ingredients of great neighborhoods. So you're kind of starting at a much smaller scale in terms of what is appropriate for each neighborhood, and then deciding which ingredients kind of you can compose and put together in a recipe that makes that neighborhood. And so this is one of the examples of one of the zone district standards for Cincinnati, where it's called a T4 neighborhood small footprint. And this is the range of types that are allowed. And you can see here there's actually a minimum lot size for each of the types. It's sort of calibrated for each of the types. But you know, as a builder, developer, even maybe as somebody looking to buy a house in this area, kind of what is likely and what is possible in this particular neighborhood. It's just getting really direct and jumping right into it. And similar to the way that a conventional zoning code has supplemental to use standards, a form-based code has supplemental form standards. So for each of the types, and this example is the bungalow court, you need some specific standards about the minimum width of a courtyard, the minimum depth of a courtyard, maybe the maximum size of the buildings. And that's really important to think about it kind of in that really fine-grained way. And then so ultimately, your zoning map sort of reflects the intended scale and form and the hierarchy of that intended scale and form as opposed to a range of uses and densities. So it's kind of just a different way of thinking about it. So one of the things I often recommend in a community like Boise is to start by graphically assessing your existing zoning code. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but work with your local AIA, hire a couple local architects, and don't show the best case build-out example, but take 5 or 6 typical lot sizes for each base zoning district and show the worst case scenario build-out to understand what your current zoning code allows and start thinking about what are the limitations and obstacles in place to allow missing middle to happen. So where else is missing middle being used? So places like Nashville, I just sort of came across a community called Sand Springs in the Georgia area that they're actually embedding missing middle housing into their comprehensive plans as a strategy to provide diverse housing choices and affordability across their community. The state of Michigan has this amazing statewide economic development strategy based on placemaking, and they're using missing middle housing as one of the implementation tools. So it's really cool to see it happening sort of at that scale. And they actually require what they call a target market analysis. It's sort of a market analysis that's targeted specifically to looking forward and assessing by each one of these building types what the market is for each of those types in the different communities. And in Austin, Texas, we're actually creating an affordable housing density bonus program where, you saw this fourplex earlier. Right next to this fourplex was the building of the exact same size, height, width, and depth that had 8 units as opposed to 4 units in it. But you would never notice that unless you stop and look very carefully at it. So in Austin, we're allowing a builder to kind of not increase the size of that footprint, but to actually pour up to 4, 5, 6 additional units into that volume as long as they meet the sort of affordability indexes that we'll be defining in the project. So there's some really creative things you can do with this. I just want to mention, I'm sort of getting close to closing here so we can talk about this, you can ask questions. We launched the Missing Middle website about 9 months ago now. So it's just missingmiddlehousing.com because we were getting so many questions about this, so many calls, that we just wanted to define this missing middle housing and provide a great resource. So I just encourage you to go look at this type. It has these range of types, it has documented examples, it has the densities, it has square footages, lot sizes, all the information you might want to look for. Then we've actually, as we document these examples, as we go from different cities to cities, we actually are starting a catalog of these, and we're hoping really shortly to actually enable other communities to take these downloadable documentation templates and add their documentation examples to this website, as well as we're starting a Google Maps process where we're pinpointing missing middle types in all the communities we're working in, and we're going to put those online, and we're hoping other people will sort of participate and do those in their communities as well. So just a really, really great resource that I just encourage you to look at if you're more interested in more. So in conclusion, number one, missing middle housing, it enhances neighborhoods. It can make them more vibrant and even more diverse and better. It meets the demand for walkable urban living, that growing demand and that gap that I talked about. It's sort of a great tool to address that gap and to fill that gap. Right? It meets this demand for more diverse housing choice. It addresses the need for affordability, and it's really affordability by design as a starting point, which is a really great way to start. And then it provides, a really great thing about it is it provides the number of rooftops or the density that are necessary to provide those small local businesses, that coffee shop, that bakery, that restaurant, as well as to support transit. At about 16 units per acre, densities are transit supportive. So I just want to encourage you all to reframe the conversation here in Boise. Let's stop using those terms, density and multifamily, and even rezoning is a pretty scary. And let's talk about sort of what are appropriate forms, what's an appropriate scale, and what types of housing is the market really looking for. Let's not forget about multi-generational housing, right? Because that's a big part of this conversation as well, as some families are choosing to live under one rooftop with multiple generations. And it's really time to sharpen the pencils in terms of a regulatory framework. And I can tell by your zoning code that there's been several iterations of refinements, and I just encourage you to keep making those refinements. And to end with a quote, and this is from, if you've read the ULI publication called What's Next, I think it was published probably 3 or 4 years ago. I just really like this quote. It's time to rethink and evolve, reinvent and renew. I mean, to me, that says it all. It's like we can't be stuck in the way that we've done things and thought about things in the past. We really need to be proactive and think about how we're going to address these dramatic shifts in our communities to enable them to remain, to be great communities, and to continue to attract great businesses, great people in our communities. And I like to end with this question. The market is waiting, and I'm encouraging you as people who practice here, who work for the city, to figure out ways that you can respond to sort of these dramatic shifts. Thank you.